Hey guys, Dave from Nerdarchy, for nerds, by nerds, hang out with these nerds.
I'm Ted.
I'm Nathan Nerdark.
And today we're going to be doing another edition of What Does Your Race Say About You? Today we're getting Gnome with it and talking about the gnome.
We're going to jump down the description below. You can sign up for Nerdarchy, the newsletter. It's a great way to get gaming tips as well as learn how to game with us.
So gnome is really one of those weird races that's kind of like, in earlier editions of the game, it was literally described as kind of like a dwarf. and whenever, you know you're in trouble, whenever you're describing something in the game, it's kind of like something else. Because then you're like, why not just play that something else?
Right. Yeah, it's a fantasy game where you have a myriad of different things, and it's like, well, yeah, these guys are like their cousins.
I feel like Dragonlance was the first campaign setting to take the gnome and really draw a line in the sand and make them different.
We're going to make something unique here.
And that was the Tinker Gnome.
Yeah.
And in 5th edition, we see a little bit of that coming back as well. And then also in 5th edition, we also have we have 3 varieties of gnome right now. We have the rock gnome,
The forest gnome.
the forest gnome, and the Snurfneblin.
The deep gnome.
Yes.
Because nobody likes to pronounce Snurfneblin.
I kind of like pronouncing it. It feels good. Snurfneblin. You can say it different ways. It's fun.
Yeah.
So, and unlike the other races, I feel like the different subspecies of gnome are very different from each other.
I think so.
You have the hill dwarf and a mountain dwarf, and they're still very much the same. The only real difference is where they live.
And there's times that you will find mountain dwarves living in the ground with the hill dwarves with mountain dwarves, or mountain dwarves with the hill dwarves, because their racial features are slight in the subspecies, whereas the majority of being a dwarf is all in the core race.
Yeah, dwarfiness.
And with the gnomes, they fall into that kind of small, like, they could be David the Gnome and be like jovial and happy and talk to forest creatures, or they could be like I tried to star in the Leprechaun movie. Like you can get like a really big, wide difference and it feels right. Like it doesn't feel like like that one role's forced on the gnome, or this role, the David the Gnome's forced on the gnome. I feel like there's enough of different types of gnomes that they've got like.
And
a
here's
wide
the other
play.
thing too. Like when you look at the 3 varieties of gnome, like the layman, like the standard human could be like, oh, these are different if you stand them all next to each other. Where you take a dwarf, a hill dwarf and a mountain dwarf, you stand them next to each other and they're like, hey, it's a dwarf. And I almost feel like it's the same thing with the elves as well. They're gonna be like, oh, well, that elf is kind of slumming it, where that one dresses better, but they still kind of look like elves, and then you're like, oh, that one's freaking evil. And the only variety is between the drow, the dark elves, and the other 2.
Right.
But no, each subspecies of gnomes are really different. I mean, let's look at the forest gnome. If you look at the racial trait, speak with woodland creatures, woodland animals. Even though this segment we don't talk about the
mechanics
that much, but this one's important because it defines kind of who they are and who they interact with.
It changes their entire day, what they do.
They are more inclined to be a part of like the Fey order than the natural world, because it's like, oh yeah, I can just go up and talk to that squirrel, no big deal. Like what?
Well, then you also have the difference between, you have the rock gnome, let's say, and then you have a tinker, and then you have the forest gnome. The forest gnome's like, oh yeah, I love creatures, and the other ones are like, oh yeah, we love creatures too. But it's like, yeah, but I asked him how his cousin was doing, and they had a problem, or they got flooded, their house got flooded. And you're just like, oh no, that's terrible that this happened to your cousin. It's like, yeah, the fox is really having a hard time. Like, what? Who are you talking about? It's like, those are just critters.
And now we know what the fox said.
Yes.
And so now our rock gnome in 5th edition is essentially the Tinker Gnome.
Yep.
In previous editions, he gets the Tinker tools, and he has a couple special things he can make. They're not particularly useful for the game, but they're kind of flavorful. And from that, if a player says, can I make this other thing that's similar to any of those things, I'd be like, sure. It's an easy enough extrapolation, but it says something about them and their bent, and the fact that of all the races, that would make them the most technologically advanced, in my opinion.
I would agree.
Or inclined.
Yeah, right. More like an engineer's mind, where you're thinking about how something goes together, how it could be taken apart, how could it be made better, and what's wrong with what I'm looking at right now.
And then they're going to take it to kind of that nth degree. Now, being technologically inclined, I feel of the races that are presented in the player's handbook, the rock gnome, in my brain, is the most specialized in that kind of thing, because you say, okay, well, I want to make a character that makes something. Like a rock gnome is the first go-to, in my opinion.
Right, and it's well known that they're the most likely to play techno music. No, just me. All right.
I think it's just you.
You know, and then we have the Snurfneblin, who basically live in the ground, and they are actually probably the most like dwarves, except for in some ways like even more dwarf than a dwarf.
They dug way too deep,
and they stayed there,
and they liked it.
They're all about gems, and earlier editions of the game they had an affinity for earth elemental creatures. I don't think that gets stressed in 5th edition as much as it did previous. I think like even to the point of like at a certain level they could summon earth elementals.
Right.
They're down with the earth, definitely. And
and they're also down in the earth.
Yes, indeed. I would also say with the
Deep gnomes.
Deep gnomes. It's safer that way. I'd say that out of all the terrible like chaos nastiness of the Underdark, they're like the best guys and gals down there. Is what I, like. They're like the paladins of the Underdark compared to what's down there.
You're 100% accurate. In the beneath in our world, or in the Underdark, you've got the Drow, evil elves. You got the Dorgar, the evil dwarves. You've got mind flayers, beholders, loads of aberrations, and then you've got the deep gnomes, the Snurfneblin, a goodly race who were like, yeah, we're just going to settle in with these guys. We'll be fine.
Well, and then the other thing too is gnomes have always been very much into illusion magic, which kind of lends to the idea of deception and trickery and mischief. The Snurfneblin Deep Gnome, they get a couple abilities that actually aid them with that, and so do the Forest Gnome. They get minor illusion as a cantrip.
Right.
And traditionally, in previous editions, that they were more likely to be illusion as a wizard. And matter of fact, that was actually one of my first characters was an illusionist thief who met with a horrible end.
Yeah, I think 5th edition does a good job of putting in that little bit of magic to further separate the idea of we're just the dwarf's cousins kind of thing.
Yeah, and so you have the different regions where they're going to live. Like I feel like now you have the gnomes as far as the rock gnome, where they might share the same region as a dwarf, but they live their life a lot different than a dwarf. And then you have the forest gnome, who actually they're closest, I would say.
They're closer to elves.
Yeah, they're closer to elves than they are dwarves or even other gnomes in some regards. And then you have the Snurfneblin, like we said, that kind of delved too deep and just stayed there. They're this like bright spot in the darkness.
And it's got to say something about them by being where it's so harsh and, for lack of a better word, miserable, and they still retain their goodly alignment bent.
Yeah, so like I see the deep gnomes as being like very, very like solemn characters. If you were to portray one, where I feel like the opposite end of the spectrum is going to be your forest gnome, and I feel like they're going to be the most mischievous and pranksters.
Yeah, like a carefree hippie trickster kind of guy.
Yeah, like almost like a less serious elf.
Yeah,
and
his big nose turns down a little bit more. He doesn't have it up too high, as high as the elves.
Exactly. And then you have the rock gnomes like smack dab in the center, where they're going to have more of the good naturedness of the forest gnome, but I feel like
they'll have some of the solemnity of the deep gnomes.
And I feel like they're going to be the most inquisitive of all three of the gnomes.
I would agree. I think they're going to, especially when it pertains to something that they really care about. I think the forest gnomes will care more about nature and that kind of stuff, or maybe something that not specifically interests them, but something that they want. Whereas the rock gnomes will be looking for something specifically interesting to them.
I feel like if any race sub race made science, those would be the type that would do it. The rock gnomes.
Right.
like developing towards that kind of idea of.
Well, sure. Like it wouldn't be a far stretch instead of them being involved. Instead of them having the tinker stuff for it to be alchemy or something else. If you're going to have a mad scientist, it's going to be the rock gnomes.
Yeah.
Really. It's almost like they really just wanted to call them tinker gnomes, but they didn't go. They didn't go full Dragonlance.
They didn't push it. They didn't push it up to 10.
Yeah. Just 9.5 or so.
Yeah. We all know what they wanted to call them.
Yeah, pretty much. So, more than likely, guys, if you're seeing this video, you're going to be seeing it around the same time we're going to be releasing in September, so October rewards, and we just put together an actual monk archetype that is basically based off of a different organization video we did based off forest gnomes.
Right.
The Order of the Chained Fist. So you guys
I remember that.
You guys can look for that. That's coming soon. If you're not already a patron, you can check it out and get involved with that. But I think that pretty much covers our gnomes for now. I mean, we could probably go on and on.
There's plenty to talk about, but I believe that covers, the
gist.
The gist.
So with that, you guys like, share, and subscribe.
You can check us out over on nerdarchy.com.
So check out funny memes and other things on the Facebook.
So until next time, stay nerdy.